Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And in the middle of a busy news week and a busy news day, we've got Kevin Roose, columnist for the New York Times. Columnist, that we call you, writer, author? What's the right term to use?
I guess my technical title is tech columnist, but
Tech
you can
columnist. Okay,
call me whatever
columnist.
you want. Just don't call me
Columnist for the
late for
New
dinner.
York Times. Yes, exactly. And now podcaster, which will let you actually, Kevin, maybe before I ask the question, maybe tell it, because this question is a little bit about what the podcast is about. So Hard Fork, what's the podcast?
Great question, Roy. Hard Fork is
Incisive.
a weekly tech show that I am co-hosting along with my friend and fellow tech journalist Casey Newton. Every week, we take a dive behind the headlines and try to explain what's happening in tech and what we're thinking about and hearing from sources about. And we're just trying to unpack a little bit of the crazy news that's coming
All
out
right,
of the
so
tech
I
industry.
will ask you then a slightly, maybe not incisive, but a slightly more difficult question, which is literally what we really needed in the world was two white dudes talking to each other about tech in a podcast.
It's never been done before, and frankly, we
Uh-huh.
decided we needed to run the experiment.
That's it. That's it. What is your experience? What was it you felt was missing that you wanted to add? And you and Casey both have, I'll compliment you after you answer the question maybe, but what did you feel you wanted to add to the conversation?
Well, I mean, really what we wanted to do was to give people a way to sort of get their arms around what was happening in the tech industry. I mean, we text each other all the time, about crazy things that are happening in the tech industry that frankly just don't seem to make a lot of sense, or we're digging into them. And I think we both felt like there was space for a nuanced and thoughtful conversation between two reporters who are really going out there and digging in to some of these issues, and space to bring in other reporters and newsmakers. And so for us, it's just kind of a chance to catch up every week, and hopefully people enjoy listening to it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is that sometimes there are people who talk to each other and you're like, why don't you just make your conversation public, because the rest of us could all learn from it a bunch. And so I imagine your podcast is that, although I've really appreciated, I said this to you before, but I've really appreciated the generative AI voices that you're using to create the voices for some of the categories. It's a little self-referential. I won't say it is meta, but lowercase m meta. And also both of you have just been on a tear of what you've been writing about. I mean, Casey's piece, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, about like the details of the Twitter saga at this moment. I mean, it's just been great. So, okay. So that will then lead me to the question for today, which is practical question for working people, which is related to the stuff you've written about in your book, and the stuff that, gets chattered about in the side channel, I think is the name of the Discord that Casey and a few other journalists have, which I think is really great, which is a frequent thing that happens to a working person is they read or hear about some new technology, Web3, the metaverse, generative AI. And one of the questions is, if I try to play with every one of these, I'd spend all day just messing around with new tech. But if I ignore them all, then I'm behind the curve. I mean, I just showed another VC 10 minutes ago. I was like, you haven't played with GPT-3 yet? Like, it's free. And I like 30 seconds later, he's playing with it. So how do you think about, if another colleague who's a journalist at the Times were saying, what technology should I be like actually paying attention to and which ones should I ignore? How do you think people ought to go about that?
Well, I'm biased because I think this stuff is very cool, but I really think that generative AI is, I mean, it's such a buzzword. It's such a trend right now in Silicon Valley, but it also is legitimately quite interesting. I think a lot of people, including me, have been somewhat skeptical of AI for a lot of years because it just didn't seem like the technology was actually delivering real, tangible benefits to people. But the underlying tech, the large language models, have gotten quite good now, and not just for text, but for images, for video, even. And I've been speaking to people in all kinds of creative industries, from advertising to filmmaking to interior design, who are already using generative AI and totally changing the way that they work. So whereas, before, if you were an interior designer and you needed to show a client a mock-up of, what their house might look like with a different design scheme, like that was going to be like a laborious manual process. And now you just have these programs where you can just type in, you upload a picture of your living room and you say, okay, make it look tropical. And the AI will just figure out what that means and make its best guess.
Totally.
So that kind of thing is very cool and has applications for more than just art. I mean, I have used DALL-E and other sort of generative AI models to illustrate my columns. And I think we're going to see a lot more AI generated content in journalism going forward.
So let me ask you this, because the lowercase m meta question again, as I type into GPT-3, which new technology should I take seriously and which should I ignore, is, so that's an example of a new technology that one should take seriously right now. Maybe I'll ask you about the ones to ignore in a second. But what if you can distill what it is about that technology at this moment that you believe is worth paying attention to? I guess I heard you say it's immediately useful to people in a wide range of occupations. Is there more? Is that what you look for?
Yeah, I look for, is this going to move the needle on how people actually work or live?
Yeah.
Is this going to get into people's workflows at work, who are, not first adopter? And I really look for sort of signs of it moving beyond the kind of pool of early adopters. Like if the only people who are on a given app are venture capitalists, no offense, but it's sort of a signal that, like, this might become something, but it's not
For
quite
sure.
there yet.
I mean, I
But
remember when free-to-play games were a big thing, web-based free-to-play games. The one that got VC funded was like the golf one. And I was like, yeah, because VCs play a lot of golf. Like, not because it's actually a thing.
Yeah. So
But
I look for broader adoption, before I start really paying close attention to something. And I think also just you can see the sort of results. I mean, some of these companies are generating piles of real revenue. I mean, Jasper is the sort of
totally.
AI generated content, sort of writing. It's sort of a copywriting app for
Yeah.
marketers, but it uses GPT-3, and they've got millions of dollars in revenue, and they're raising at some crazy valuation that I now forget. But they're making real money with this stuff.
And so how do you think about things that are buzzy? When something is buzzy, you ignore it when it's only the VCs and the early adopters who are playing with it, or how do you think about that?
Well, I think there can be some signal in what VCs and early adopters are paying attention to, because sometimes, I remember when Twitter was just VCs and
Sure.
early
Good
adopters, and
point.
then it
Good
became
point.
huge. So it's not that every product that starts in that community, fails to break out. But
Sure.
I generally like when I start, getting texts from people that I, don't work with, who aren't in the tech industry, from my sort of, normal friends, like I start thinking, oh, maybe this is a tipping point. And that's an imperfect metric, and there are many
No,
others, but that's one signal that I
but
use.
I think it's a good indicator. I mean, I've also, for me, I try to spend as much time as I can talking with people who are outside of tech, and I just show them stuff. And one of the things I discovered was that people were much more generally people were much more impressed with the text generation AI than the image generation AI.
Hmm.
And I wasn't quite sure why that was. I think some of it is because we're actually used to the experience of typing some words into a box and getting back an image that's a reasonable fit, because there's so many images out there that it just looked like image search, even if you explained to them what they were doing. Whereas there was something about the text gradually appearing on the screen,
Mhm.
like just the user interface of it, plus seeing how perfectly suited it was to that moment, that I think seemed to amaze people more. I mean, I definitely people in government was like getting them on, GPT-3 and getting them to try. Meanwhile, GPT-3's answer to our question reflects the fact that I think it stopped crawling the internet a couple years ago. So it says big data, perfectly state of the art circa, I don't know,
Mm.
2014, artificial intelligence and blockchain. Sure, yeah, fine. But it does go to show, some of both the plain language capabilities. It understood the question and gave a plausible answer, and the limitations of it in terms of the actual substance of the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Any other tips in terms of when you start using something, how you start using? Because you must get sent, hey, journalist guy, please try this new app, like more times than you can even hit delete in your inbox. Anything in terms of what you decide to do that you think of?
I mean, I'll try most things. I tend to be pretty promiscuous with what apps I'll try, and even, hardware and stuff like that. So I'll try most things, but it's, in terms of, I think with something, and we can talk about this more if you want, but with something like VR and the metaverse, like that's something that I tried and I wrote about it. But I think that sort of I think there are sort of several different kinds of sort of mainstreaming, that have to happen with that. So, is VR going to be mainstream? Well, maybe it'll be mainstream for gamers, but it won't be mainstream
Right.
for non-gamers, or maybe it'll be mainstream in the workplace, but maybe not. And so I think with something like that, I try never to sort of predict too closely what the trajectory is going to be, because that's not something I'm super good at, and I've been wrong before. So I tend to just think like, okay, is it worth writing about at this moment in its cycle, for whatever cycle that is?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'll just say for me personally as a VC, one of the things I've noticed is the more dismissive I am of something, the more I have trained myself to try it, which is honestly Bitcoin in 2013. Like, I'm so grateful that I leaned forward and tried, because when I first heard about HTML in 1994, I was like, these blue links seem really stupid. And I probably lost 10 plus years where I could have been engaged in that if I just quieted the voice in my head that thinks it knows what's going on and tried something.
Yeah, and I think, to the extent that I have skin in the game, like I don't invest in
Sure.
technology companies,
You have reputation and
but it's
readers and all
reputation.
that
And
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and I wrote a thing in 2013 saying Bitcoin is dead, it's never coming back, and then I had that screenshotted and tweeted at me for the next 10 years. But
Yeah.
you're going for someone, another journalist once told me that journalists go for batting average, not that if we're getting 50% of our calls right, that's actually decent.
This is why the VC game is so much easier. Not only were we not batting average, not only were we not slugging percentage, not only were we not how many grand slams you've hit, which is what one VC said. Literally, you are measured by the tape measure distance of your single longest home run. And that's it.
Mm,
I can miss everything else. But as long as that one is,
that's
and
right.
once every 10 years you have one, it's pretty good. All right. Anything else you want to add before we wrap, Kevin?
No, this has been really fun. Thank you.
Okay, you can find Kevin and Casey's podcast by just, well, that URL is there, but also just by searching Hard Fork Podcast. You'll find it. If you want to find this and other episodes, you can go to thisisnotadvice.work. Maybe, Kevin, you'll consider doing a short form version of Hard Fork that's just a preview, in which case folks can go to Jam and get a short audio version of this, which is just a minute, and that's where I get my daily podcast dosage from. And just a reminder, the reason we say this is not advice is actually neither Kevin or I has any idea what you should do. We're just offering our own experiences. So thank you, Kevin.
Thanks for having me.
To be